Hello and welcome. We are your hosts Sandesh and Anshuman. In each episode, we will pick one seemingly boring security topic and talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between. So join us for some fun, some conversations, and some super hot takes about all things security in the Boring AppSec podcast.
Welcome back to Boring AppSec. Anshuman, how are you doing?
I'm good, Sandesh. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm excited about today because it kind of stems off a question that I think Nipun Gupta, shout out to Nipun, asked you on your on your LinkedIn post when you spoke about questions or type of content that people want you to create, right? And I'll read out the question and then let's spend this episode sort of trying and talking about it and trying to answer the question, right? So let me read it out. So his question was he wanted us to talk about running an effective AppSec program with with an extremely high engineer to AppSec ratio, the good, bad, and the ugly, right? Okay, so if I understand this question correctly, we have this theory based on I think BSIM data, etc., that the engineers of security engineers to engineers in an organization is very skewed. In some cases, it's 1:100. In the best case, maybe it's like 3:100. I think in some cases, according to the latest BSIM report. But in many companies, it's definitely even less than 1:100. So the question I think is if the ratio is that skewed, how should an application security engineer think about building their program? What should they do about it? How can they get most bang for the buck, even though the ratios are low, right? I mean, the one answer is increase the ratio or increase the number of people, but let's assume that's not necessarily a possibility, right? And then let's take it from there. I feel like we have a one-word answer to this whole thing, and we can just end the episode in 5 seconds, but we won't do that, right? So we'll talk about it a little more. So, what do you think, Anshuman? How do you handle really skewed AppSec engineer to engineer ratio in a company?
Yeah, no, I think we've spoken about this before, just before the episode, and I think we both agree that automation is your one word, which is essentially how any company can even survive, without any security breaches. So yeah, I think automate is basically our recommendation here.
Yeah.
But again, there's so many nuances to this that we can dig into. So yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I would think, right? So I agree with you. I think it's a one word answer, automation, but it's obviously way more complex than that. So we'll dig into it. But automation and security itself is such a large topic. So my recommendation is, since Nipun asked about AppSec, so let's just talk about AppSec automation today, and what that means, etc. And then we'll kind of take that from there. Okay. So yeah. So let's see. If what aspects of application security can you automate? How do you know where to start? What kind of things to automate? Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one way to think about this is in any application security team program, right? There's going to be some flavors of tools, some flavors of operations. Like how do you operationalize the process of finding vulnerabilities? The whole vulnerability management in general. Um, and then there's going to be flavors of different kinds of reporting mechanisms by which you want to show these outcomes to your executives and all the other engineering folks in the company. So I think in my personal experience, automating some of the operational stuff, right, like running scanners, trying to attribute vulnerabilities to the right owners, operationalizing, generating metrics and whatnot, right? I
Yeah.
think these are some things that can be automated, and they should be automated. But everything else, right, when it comes to doing manual security activities like threat modeling or design reviews, or just kind of speaking to your engineering counterparts and asking them questions about what is it that they're struggling with, I think these are things that you have to spend some cycles on. You can't
Yeah.
really automate them. So that's been my general experience so far.
Yeah, no, I think I kind of agree, right? I also feel like there's kinds of automation which kind of sometimes leads to more manual work, right? So, for example, the more scanners you set up, the more vulnerabilities you have, the more false positives you have, and removing false positives is almost like a manual task today, right? So, let's go deep on that, right? So, I think if I summarize what you said, you essentially need to automate different things. One is finding vulnerabilities, is like, or finding defects is one thing that you have to automate on. You have to automate like the communication to your team, so whether it's metrics to your CXOs or talk about the program to your to your engineering leaders, etc. So you can automate some of that as well. And then essentially there are certain things which have traditionally been non-automatable, like we spoke about building relationships with stakeholders in previous episodes, so that's obviously you don't want a bot to do that. We spoke about design reviews, but we'll talk about that a little later as well, because I feel like,
Yeah,
the time is here to
yeah.
automate design reviews. But we'll talk
I
about that
totally
later.
agree with that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But traditionally, you're right. Threat modeling and design reviews are one thing which has been extremely hard to kind of automate, right? So let's dig deep into that, right? So we'll pick up the two sections. One is finding defects and a whole defect management journey, and the second thing is like communication and keeping people posted on things. Like those are the two broad automation areas in AppSec, if you think about it, right? So let's dig
Mhm.
deeper. So section one is finding vulnerabilities. So where do you start? Let's say you're a typical tech company, you have a ton of software, your focus is application security only right now for this conversation, and you want to find defects, right? And let's say you have like a third party pen tester and that's all you've been doing for compliance reasons, but now we want to go the next step and actually build an AppSec program. So where do you start your defect discovery journey and how do you automate?
Yeah, yeah. That is essentially how the world management story starts, right? And you need to think about your applications and your infrastructure. So you need to find defects, vulnerabilities in both the software that you write as well as the infrastructure where you deploy that software, right? And here you can make a decision whether you want to buy something commercial or you can use some open source tools. We have discussed a little bit about this in the previous episode, but I think just kind of choosing different kinds of tools to find different kinds of vulnerabilities is uh, where the journey starts, right? So there's DAST, there's SAST, there's SCA. Again, like without going into too much detail, static, dynamic, source code reviews, and there are different tools to for all these different activities, right? Right.
Yeah, so I think the question I have is, so if you're, let's just pick up something, right? Let's just pick up one of them, or we don't have to pick one of them. But when you making a build versus buy decision in a really small AppSec team, is it by default that you should just buy? Because the way I look at it is that if you have to use an open source tool and do all the things yourself, is it actually harder to do that in a setup where your AppSec to developer engineering is very skewed? Like I guess my question is: is it almost inevitable that you just have to buy these tools, and if you can't buy them, then don't do them? Or am I kind of reading too much into this?
Yeah, I in my experience, I think when you're already struggling with resources and when you are the only one AppSec person, or when it's a small team, whether you buy something commercial or if you use open source, the time you spend in like in implementing these scanners and getting the value out of it is more or less the same, right? Because even some of these commercial tools, you can plug these tools into your infrastructure and application, and then you can start seeing results. But are those results catered to the risk belonging to your organization? Probably not, right? And for that to actually extract value from it, you have to put in some efforts of fine tuning it, configuring it, whatnot, right? Same thing with open source. With open source, you have the code base, you can change it to however you want, right? And I've seen companies do that. They take open source tools and then they make their own version of it, right? So I think, yeah, you might be reading too much into it. I'm not quite sure, because I
No, yeah,
think
yeah.
I've seen companies with one or two AppSec folks, and they are using open source tooling just fine.
Yeah, so
So
I think two important points there, right? So I think one is about commercial tools do not make, so they make certain things easy, but it's not intuitive what they make easy, right? So for example, if you're buying a static analysis tool, let's say a commercial tool, they may make like integration with your code repo simpler. They might make onboarding easier. They may take away some of your infrastructure worries by giving you a hosted solution or a SaaS platform or whatever. But they don't know, there are very few tools who make it easier to customize the rules for your code base, right? So
I
that, I
agree.
don't think there's a open source versus commercial distinction. There are definitely some tools which are better
Mm.
than the others, right? And that's fine, but I don't
Yeah.
think open source versus commercial makes a difference. Where it really makes a difference is if you have to educate 100 developers on something, then the commercial tool provider might give you like a really nice well done training program which makes it easier for developers to learn, right? So they
Mm.
kind of, because they're commercial, because they have the resources to help you, so they may kind of show some TLC and then kind of help you kind of get there. But you're right, on as far as effectiveness of a tool goes, the kind of vulnerabilities they find, the only way to do this is to tune it, and then you have to do it anyway, whether it's commercial or open source. That's one. I think the second point, I think where you kind of hit you kind of alluded to it towards the end, is that if you're actually, it also depends on the composition of your application security team, right? If your application security team is mostly filled with manual pen testers who
Mm.
are not good at automation, then I think it may even get harder to do some of this customization, and you may have to rely on like external people, right? But if you're a good AppSec team, right, and I always feel like you're not a good apps. I mean, okay, no shade on anyone, but if you're an application security, you have to have the ability to code at least a little bit. I'm not saying build like production
Mhm.
scale products, right, but at least have some ability to tinker around, right? And if you don't have that, then I think that's a bigger problem than automation, right? So even if you have a really
Yeah.
small team, if you're a team of one, then you better know how to automate. If you're a team of one plus have the ability to hire one more, and if you're not an automation person, I would highly recommend that you hire someone who can automate really well. I think that was kind of the case with me, right? So when I kind of started, I was very much a security person but never ran a program. I was more in consulting, so the amount of automation I had to do was very little, right? I mean, the focus was
Mhm.
more on security research and understanding, and using the tools already exist to kind of deliver the security research in a manner that security that customers like. But when you become a product security engineer and application security engineer, you don't have those guardrails, right? And you have to kind of customize to your company. And then I learned a little bit of automation, but I made sure that we hired people who can really really automate. Even if it's a small team, it better have at least one person. So the way I look at it is that the secret to success, if you're a small team, based on what you're saying and based on my experience as well, is that you must have at least one person who can actually automate, whether that's using an open source tool and customizing it for your needs, or a commercial tool and customizing for your needs, or building something quick and dirty to test something out. It's critical that you have some amount of automation skills.
Yeah, no, and I think the way you explain it is just perfect, right? Like, I've always struggled to explain this to myself as to um, why I think automation is important and why everybody should do that. But I never thought about, just because I can automate, I have some software engineering skills. That means everybody has. I think I was just kind of assuming, going by the fact that when I think of an AppSec team, people know how to code, right? Turns out it's a very spicy take on this. I think I've heard and seen folks having different opinions on this, right? Like, should security people know how to code? And I think most of really good security people and teams, if you speak to them, right? If, for example, Netflix is, I think, the best example out there, right? The amount of open source tools that they've given to the world, for free, I think that's commendable. And I think I have so much respect for all the things that they do for the community. I've not seen any company sort of open source as many tools as they do, right? So, and again, I think that's happening because everybody knows how to code. I know a few people there, and they are brilliant, smart software engineering folks with their background. I think security happens after that, right? So I think, yeah, you know,
Yeah,
couldn't agree more
yeah.
that if it's a small team, yes,
Also, a couple of
go
more
ahead.
things. There is, know how to code is like a weird thing, right? In the sense that if
Hmm.
you're a pen tester, if you're a manual pen tester, you're a bug bounty hunter, also you have to code to automate some of your payloads, right? But that's not the kind of automation you are talking about when you're building an AppSec program, which is more like use an external tool, make it available to developers, right? So I would distinguish coding with coding to make your life easier versus coding to
Hmm.
make other people's life easier, because then you have to think about
Sure.
empathy for users, UX, and all that, which most good programmers have, but not necessarily like coders. So I would say that most security engineers, like myself, I put myself, though I started my career as a developer, as a software engineer, when I got into security, for the longest time I just wrote code which was useful to me, right? But when I started building a security team, I kind of had to write code which is useful to engineers, to other security teams, other people in security, and so on and so forth. It kind of became it's a slightly different skill set. Another hack you can use if you are in a company with a terrible security to engineer ratio is that it by definition means there are a lot of engineers, right? So the one thing you can do is, if you can find engineers who are looking for a side project. And the one thing I know about
Yeah.
developers is that they love side projects. There are many developers, I mean, there's some developers who don't, who just want to go home and chill and stuff like that. But most good developers I know always like side hustles, side projects, and security is something they care about. And especially AppSec is something they care about, because in the end they can empathize with the usage, right? Because it's in the end geared towards developers at some point. At least the outcome has to go to the developers. So the one thing you can do, if you don't absolutely have no automation engineers in your team, or programmers in your team, is go find a way in your company. How do you kind of get projects on people's time? right? Is there like a 20% policy where you can do whatever you want? Is there like a friendly engineering manager who's kind of looking for cool projects for his team to engage in? Is there a platform BU which is good at building platforms, and then you can go and talk to them, right? So I think leveraging engineers becomes important in general, I think, and we'll talk about this in the rest of the podcast as well. If you have a small team, then you have to
Mm-hmm.
leverage what you already have, right? So if you don't have an incident
Mm-hmm.
management team because you have two people and then none of them can do incident management, then you have to then your company has incident management, right? They do deal with incidents.
Yeah.
So go figure out who deals with
Yeah.
incidents and take their help, right? So I would say the same thing for automation as well. If you can't automate, and if you know, and sure, I think it's easy to say, hey, but just learn, right? And that's true, and you can learn, but then you're fighting timelines and deadlines and prioritization and all that. Then see if you can also piggyback on people who already are good programmers.
Yeah, yeah. I actually have a question for you on that point. So I think what you just alluded to is something like a security champions program, right? You identify security champions on the engineering teams, and then you work with them. Like, is that accurate, or do you
No, I
think
mean,
security
I think
champions
champions
is
is, yeah, that's different, right? Because that is almost to
okay?
say, hey, you have a business unit, you have 5 pods in that business unit, you want somebody to be responsible for a given pod. Then how do you kind of, you can't scale, so can you use security champions? So I think security champions is important, and I've built a security champions program before, fairly successful, really liked it. There's some downfalls to it, maybe that's another episode altogether, right? But what I'm essentially saying is that there's certain problems in security which are very much engineering problem statements. So let me give an
Sure.
example, right?
Yeah.
I know we want to talk about this later, but let's say we do secure by default libraries, right? Most companies with a decent engineering culture have some default libraries they use for logging, for tracking, for monitoring, for example. If you have like a microservices culture, there's usually like a template of a microservices culture that you can fork and then start building your business logic into it. That's pretty common design pattern these days, right? So my sense is, if you already have somebody who's maintaining that logging library internally, can you go talk to them and say, hey, this logging library is great, it
Yeah.
standardizes a lot of things, but it's not masking PII. So can you just make a secure by default thing? I'll tell you what you mean by PII masking. I'll tell you what PII is. I'll help you with all the security knowledge of it. But can you make changes to the code in such a way that it now becomes not just the default library, but secure by default library? And and this is something which is very easy for programmers, right? It's hard for security people to do this, but for programmers, they know exactly
Mm-hmm.
how to do it, and they know how to do it in a way that helps their developers, because they again are developers themselves and they understand engineering. So if they do that and they publish it, it's kudos to them. Security can be grateful to them. You can kind of find ways to incentivize these things. So that's kind of what I mean, right? So I think there are a lot of security
Mm.
automation activities which are the periphery of engineering, and they can pretty easily do that. Another example is, for example, let's say you figured out a static analysis tool that you really like, but you're trying to figure out how to integrate that into the pipeline, right? And every company has a slightly different pipeline, different tooling they use, different philosophy on if blocking is good or if you want to do it non-blocking and stuff like that, right? So this is an org culture thing. And the
Mm-hmm.
people who are maintaining the CI/CD pipeline, nothing to do with security, but who understand kind of what tools to run, what checks to run, how to deploy, how to do deployment, etc. For them, integrating a tool like SemGrep into the pipeline is easy, right? They may not know they have to integrate SemGrep. They may not know they have to write these. They have to activate these rule sets. They may not have to know when to block, when not to block. But once you answer those questions, actually doing the integration is easy, right, for them, right? So I think these kind of tasks, which are kind of almost in between security and engineering, is something a platform engineering team can, or a regular programmer can very easily do if you find the right person in the company. So I would say, instead of
Yeah.
kind of like you hiring people to do this, you can just piggyback off them and do it. It's hard, but it's possible.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think you mentioned something like incentivizing. I think uh, there are so many companies these days that actually incentivize employees to, either praise them for some work they did or actually help them out, right? I know when I was at Atlassian, there was a program where we used to send kudos, I believe. I'm not 100% remembering, but the idea is that, there are ways to incentivize your colleagues, your employees, or whatever, right, your peers in different engineering organizations. And I think folks should use this sort of mechanism to do exactly what you mentioned, right? Find somebody in the engineering organization that you're working with who might be passionate, or who might just show you their interest, and then incentivize them. And I think that itself is a relationship being built that can take you a long way, and
Yeah.
help kind of solve multiple problems in the future. So I think that's right. One thing that I also wanted to add to this was an AppSec team or a product security team, right? They also have some incident response kind of responsibilities, right? Uh, you'll find companies that have dedicated incident response teams, and then you'll find companies that have incident response features in pretty much every security team, right? So it might be cloud security, product security. So I think one way to scale, like, or with a huge engineer ratio to a small appsec engineer ratio, it becomes really important to leverage like some of these common things that you will need in your day-to-day operations. If somebody else is doing that, or is excelling in that particular activity, then you should be doing that instead of trying to build your own thing, right? So I think going back to the culture, right, having an org culture where everybody's supportive, I think becomes huge. So
Yeah.
yeah, just wanted to mention those two things.
Oh no, I think I agree. Just one last point on the whole leveraging developers or engineers in general to do security stuff. I think you can incentivize them, but this is one downside to that, right? And the downside is that you're never P0 for them, right? I mean, obviously, because they have a day job which they have to do it. This is a side hustle.
Yeah.
Side hustle automatically means this is not going to be on their pile. So something breaks, it's
Hmm.
going to become really hard. And sometimes, and this I've found happen a few times, is the developer really wants to work on it, but the engineering manager is like, "What's the ROI on this for our
Yeah.
team, for our pod, right?" I
Yeah.
mean, sure, you get kudos, but is that like gonna match my OKRs? Like, especially companies where there's very rigid structures on these things, it gets a little harder to do this ad hoc. So the only advice I would give there is that if you can formalize this, even better. Like if there's a way to in your company to work on side projects in a way that the company encourages people to do it, then you should do it. Or if not, then you may not be able to give your P0s to them, right? Because you can probably say, hey, if it's an 80-hour project, you can do this over a quarter is something which is possible if you can manage it well. But if it's a P0 and it's really critical for security and it has to happen in the next 2 weeks, man, then it's going to be really hard to kind of hold those developers accountable to get this happen, to make this happen, right? So
Yeah.
that's just one other thing to kind of watch out for when you're going to go use folks from other teams to help you out.
Yeah, no, I have experienced that myself, so I can totally relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we were talking about finding defects, right? So we spoke about how, like, it doesn't matter. Like open source commercial is like a separate discussion. You can do open source or commercial irrespective of, even if you're a really small team, it really depends on how well you can customize it. And hopefully you have some knowledge to do it, right? So now let's say you found a bunch of defect discovery mechanisms that works well for your company and you've implemented that. Now comes the $1 million questions. Now you probably have too many vulnerabilities, right? Which is always happens
Hmm.
because security tools have too many false positives or the false negatives sometimes as well. So how do you kind of think through defect management or vulnerability management?
Yeah, and I think this is a $1 million question for any AppSec team, right? How do you do vulnerability management effectively? And I've worked in quite a few places. I have not seen this being cracked anywhere, right? Like even when I'm with Atlassian, I mean, you would imagine a company like Atlassian, it has completely solved the vulnerability management problem. I think because they make Jira, they make Confluence, they make these kind of software that is meant to help with these problems, right? But I think they were probably the most matured I've seen. But I think they were also struggling with a bunch of other problems that other companies might not be facing. So I think prioritization is what is going to help you scale, right? Because you have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities coming from different sources of scanners. There's container issues, there's application issues, there's infrastructure issues, um, and there's no prioritization because every tool assigns the risk score or the severity score in their own ways. They don't really understand the context of your organization. They don't understand the risk appetite. So I think this is a very common problem, and if you don't have a good framework of doing prioritization on what needs to be solved, I think you're going to struggle. So I think focusing on prioritization becomes really important at that stage.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely bang on, right? This is not an automation problem. Okay, like this is one place where I don't think automation can solve it. I think many engineers, including myself, have made the mistake of assuming this is some kind of magical automation problem where you'll use a vulnerability management tool and that is what will solve this problem. It's not going to do it, right? So you will have to kind of think through prioritization here. You'll have to think about what is top priority for your company, what is top priority for your software, and that depends on what kind of a company you are, what your business model is, who your users are, etc., etc., right? And I think when you're a small application security team, which means you have limited. Like the last thing you want to spend too much time on as a small AppSec team is on program management, right? If you don't have the bandwidth, don't you should find a way to have as much async communication, as little explanation that you have to do. And the best way to do it is to say, hey, I will focus only on these four things or five things or 10 things or whatever the n number is, right? And that's hard because there are trade-offs, right? So it may so happen that you figure out that, hey, we are a fintech company, so money loss is really critical, so we'll only look at vulnerabilities which can possibly impact money loss. And that's a decision you can make, and it sounds really reasonable. And then if you have a data breach, when you're prioritizing that, you'll feel like crap, right? You'll feel like shit, right? Because you just deprioritized data leakage, and then the data leakage happened, right? So there's no right answer to this. Having said that, if you kind of want to take the model high ground and say, no, I'll prioritize everything because everything's important, that's not going to work either, right? So you've got to really take the hard call and say, look, I know what risk. I think articulation is really important here. I think you got to articulate to your company saying, look, we have minimal bandwidth. That's not going to change. You're not going to give me 4 hiring tickets. So we have to prioritize. And prioritization does not mean that everything's going to be great, even if we execute well. It means that we're taking a chance, but we're taking a chance knowing that we're doing it, right? It's a considered decision, and hopefully, if all things go well, we'll get through these quickly, and then we'll go on to something else, right? So that's kind of how we have to do it. So I think vulnerability management and prioritization is something where tooling can help, but really, crystal clear articulation and thought process is probably way more important. And I think prioritization has to happen first. Vulnerability management can happen then, right? It's kind of how I
So
look at it.
yeah, I do have a question for you on that. So how do you exactly prioritize? Because this is something I've struggled with, right? Like,
Yeah,
I know saying that prioritization is important is easy, right? But I struggle with it.
yeah.
How do you prioritize? Do you have a framework in mind?
Yeah, like for everything else, right? So I think it has to
Yeah.
be, it has to be top down, right? It has to be top down. Every company of any size, if you have a security team, it's, you can assume that you're a certain size already, right? They already have a sense of what is risk for this company. Okay, so they have a risk management thesis. They may not have an information security thesis, but they have a risk management thesis. So it has to be downstream from that, right? It's pretty straightforward. If you're in a regulated, let's say you're a regulated industry, then there are only 4 things that can go wrong, right? I'm not even making agnostic. You can lose money, you can lose data, you can be non-compliant, or you can lose availability. So the CIA triad or whatever it is, right? So within these things, you got to figure out what is most important for your company, right? If you're an infrastructure company where people depend on your uptime to stay up, right, then availability is probably going to be number one, right? So if you're Stripe, for example, okay, I don't know what Stripe's priority is, but I'm just making a guess here. They talk about like being 5 nines available, 6 nines available, I think is now what they're aiming at. If that's the case, then availability is the number one thing. Then denial of service is probably top priority for you, right? And so is money leak, right? Data breaches are really important, but maybe not as much as availability is, right? So again, it's really hard as a security person for me to even say those words out loud, saying data breach is not that important, but you have to do it, right? I mean, if you're waiting to
Yeah.
be politically correct, then yeah, you got to keep saying everything's important. But the reality is
You have to keep it real.
you got to keep it
Yeah.
real, right? So you got to pick. So if
Yeah.
you're an infra company where uptime is the most important thing for you from a company's perspective, and downtime means loss of millions of dollars, then that's it. Availability is your top priority. Like that's it. Like drop everything else until you can get a handle on availability. And I'm not saying
Ma-
be fix availability. There's no such thing. But until you get a handle
yeah.
on saying, hey, here are the tools which help me discover availability issues. Here's how we're going to track it. Here's how we're going to manage it. Once you get that in place, then you can go on to other things, right? But you've got to start from the top. So my sense is go talk to your CFO, CRO, CEO, if there's none of those roles. Ask them what your top risks for the business are. Figure out what that means from a security perspective, how that translates into security risk, and start there, right? Like do not start from OWASP problem. It makes no sense.
Yeah. Man, I have to say, I wish everybody had this level of clarity, because again, I've spoken to quite a few folks, and I've always asked them, how do you prioritize? How can I prioritize? And I've never heard it from this angle,
I'll just
saying
say
that,
it's
yeah,
easy to
you have
say
to.
this. It's easy to say this.
I know, yeah,
Way
easier said
harder
than
to
done,
actually do
right?
it, right? Yeah,
I
yeah.
know, I know. Yeah, yeah. There you go. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So
Cool. So I think that's the my answer to your question, right? So I think on vulnerability management, I agree
Yeah,
with you. I think tooling is important, and there's like whatever defect dojo and others, right? And we can go into automation of that as well.
yeah,
But I think you can start with prioritization, and then vulnerability management gets a lot easier. And I think that's pretty okay. So even if
yeah.
you prioritize, and even if you have deployed tools, and even if you've done all those things well, in general, I kind of feel like triage is kind of what takes up a lot of time of security engineers,
It
right?
does.
So do you have any thoughts
It
around
does.
how we should do, how we can, like, optimize triage?
Yeah, man. I think yeah, triage is probably the second uh, big thing in the one management story, right? And I think with triage, what becomes important is for a company to have a risk framework, right? In other words, do you know if a vulnerability that comes in, how do you assess the impact of it? How do you assess the impact of that vulnerability on the organization and the risk it might bring to it, right? So having some kind of a matrix where you figure out the likelihood and the impact, right? And then that helps you assess the overall risk, right? So I think, because if you don't have that framework in the first place, you're gonna miss out on fixing things that need to be fixed, and you'll be fixing things when there's no need, right? First of all, now automating the triage process itself can happen in some places, but I think this is probably the only stage in this world management life cycle that is very difficult to automate, because, and I say that because these scanners, again, they don't have the context of what your application is exposed to, how your application is communicating with other services components, how your application is deployed on the infrastructure. So I think somebody has to manually go and triage every vulnerability. Well, assuming you have gone through the prioritization phase, now from the hundreds of thousands of issues, let's say you're down to uh, 1000 issues, right? So I think uh, even triaging 1000 issues is a complete nightmare, right? So I'm curious to know, like, do you have thoughts on basically automating that process?
I have thoughts and prayers. That's all. Right. Right. No, I think I think it's a really hard job, and I think security engineers are really good at this. We're really really good at the whole needle in a haystack type thing, right? This is where you can't replace experience, right? I mean, like you said, we can do a lot to make it more manageable, like like you said, automation, prioritization, using better tooling, more customization, all that can be done. But in the end, you have to have that muscle. Like, I think we have to just have, like, even if you're a pen tester, it's the same thing, right? I mean, there are, you'll instinctively sometimes know that there's possibly a vulnerability on this particular input method, but you still have to go through every payload in the world. You still have to automate, you still have to try sometimes one by one, you still have to review the responses of every payload you sent out and see how you can kind of finally do it, finally exploit it, right? So I think this is just something security engineers are really good at, and the best you can do here is hire as good a security engineer as you can, who's been there, done that, right?
Yeah.
And if you're someone who's never done manual assessments, who's never looked at results, then you're going to have a hard time. This is not something, you know a lot of times when people say, and this could be another episode, saying, hey, QA folks can do security, and I'm like, they can do a lot of
Mhm.
things, but this is one thing,
Yeah.
right? The needle in a haystack thing is not something that either, I mean, I think people who do debugging, I think, also kind of have that, right? Who debug a lot of really, I mean, who have a lot of experience debugging complex code, also have that needle in a haystack approach on how to do it well. But otherwise, I think this comes down to skill in some ways, right? The only thing I would say from a process automation perspective is, if you can learn patterns and document them, it may help new people coming onto the team. So if you know that there's a particular kind of vulnerability which is always going to show up in scanners in your environment, but it's not a problem because you have a compensating control somewhere else, then maybe you can make triage easier by always marking those vulnerabilities as false positives and stuff like that, right? But that's such generic gyan that I know it's not useful, right? So all I can say is that, just hire good security engineers here, and hope you have a good team, because this is one area where, yeah, the skill of the security engineer really 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 matters.
So so I just want to add something here, and I think you will appreciate what I'm about to say, right? So I think both of us have the security consulting experience, right? My belief is, if you're looking to hire product security, application security engineers, try to find somebody who has a security consulting background. And I say that because us as security consultants, right, we've evaluated different kinds of applications for different clients, and we have actually gone through doing manual assessments on each one of these, right? So we have seen the same issue appear in different flavors, different ways, different programming languages, right? uh, Somebody who might be a software engineer, or somebody who's always been a security engineer in a product based company, I don't think they have that opportunity to see different kinds of or different ways of exploiting something. Let's just say that,
Yeah.
right? So I think having that security consulting background has at least helped me personally
Yeah.
in sort of having that understanding of how difficult or easy it is to find something, and then to triage it, and then to actually go and fix it,
Yeah.
right?
No, I mean, obviously, I agree with you. Occupational hazard. Both of us come from there, so we'll agree with it, right? But I think here's kind of how I look at it. Okay, I have like a weird analogy for this. I think consulting folks who kind of do one assessment, have varied experience of different things. Are like artisanal pizza. They like hand toss it. They make it really nicely. They put like the fine cheese that they find from some weird animal and stuff like that, right? So they're very good at very very custom things, right? But if you want freaking Dominoes, if you want like quick, dirty, fast, let's scale, do it now, kind of a thing, then I think people with more automation experience and stuff is just in general better. I think if you're hiring a pen tester, then I think it may not be a bad idea to kind of find someone with a consulting background who kind of look at many things. But in general, they don't automate. They don't because they don't work with one environment, right? So the kind of automation they do is very much helping you become a better pen tester. But the reason it's easier to automate within a company versus build a product, and I'm facing that today, right? Because I'm trying to build a product,
Hmm.
is that when you're automating within a company, there's a lot of things which are constant. Your environment is constant, your tech stack is constant, or nearly constant. The tooling you use internally is constant. So to automate in that environment is fairly straightforward. Whereas if you're building a product which you want to sell to 1,000 customers, then you have to think about every different kind of scenario. Okay, so
Hmm.
a security consultant, that's why it does not usually automate a lot of things, because they're like, hey, every customer environment is going to be different. I may even have to work on their freaking laptops. So you kind of build automation which just helps you become a little more productive, but not solve the problem. But you don't need to do that in a company. If you're working in a company with a set things of with a set of things which are constant, then you can just automate within those constraints, right? So I think diversity is important. You need to have at least one or two people who have the consulting background. It brings in a great muscle. But also, if your automation engineers are someone who are like the people who are automating the most, if there's someone who's seen platforms, who've seen engineering teams, who've kind of worked in companies similar to yours, it may be a better way to hire them.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think the consulting companies are also changing slash evolving these days. I have seen some consulting companies uh, loan their consultants to companies for few months, where they can actually go and build automation, right? So consultants have actually started to automate a bunch of stuff as well. I know
Nice.
when we were consultants, we weren't really
Yeah.
doing that, but
Yeah.
I'm saying, right, like companies are getting more innovative about how they want to solve security problems, and this is one way, right? You can think of it like a virtual CISO, but not a
Hmm.
CISO.
Yeah.
It's more like a consultant
Like a
security
virtual
engineer.
appsec engineer.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's very
Yeah.
interesting. I have not seen this. That's very good to know. Like if that can work out, I think it kind of opens up a whole new way of scaling, right? Can I come back on that note, right? Just take a
Yes,
slight
let's
tangent
do
there,
that.
right? So how do you think about kind of, when you have a small team, how do you think about augmenting with external people, right? I mean, obviously it's the same budgeting thing and all that, but when you're augmenting with external folks, you can hire them for a specific project, and then the contract ends there. So when you're hiring a full-time person, you got to think about
Yeah.
what they mean for the culture, how long are they going to be here, are they going to be long-term employees, what happens if the all the tasks they have ends in 9 months, and so on and so forth. But what are your thoughts on kind of just augmenting teams with external folks in general?
No, I think I do support that, and I've seen that it actually works. Like hiring somebody for a few months and then augmenting your team like with that person, and you can even try looking for people with the exact skills, right? Because there's always going to be candidates who have the skills and who actually would like to work with you, right? But I think at some point, as an appsec, as a product security team, you have to decide, right? Like, how long can you do that? Would you rather hire somebody full time? Because I think it's a fact. Like, I don't have the numbers, but we know that in this world today, there are not enough security engineers, but there are more security problems, right? So at some point you also have to look at the candidate pool. Like, can you even hire somebody full time, right? I think that's a big struggle in the security industry, right? I think hiring could be another thing that we speak about for hours, right?
Yeah,
Because security hiring can be very tricky, is very tricky, right? If you end up hiring the wrong person, the culture just gets
yeah.
destroyed, right? So I think my idea is that augmenting is good. We should do that as much as we can, but you need to be able to decide when hiring a full time makes more sense. And if you go that route, how exactly are you going to go about it? That becomes really
Yeah.
important.
So if I can summarize what you're saying for tactical things where you need like a quick win somewhere, it may not be a bad idea to augment someone, augment your team with someone with that specific skill set for a period of time. But if you really want to build a team which lasts for a long time and is able to think about things changing in security as well, then you're better off having a team that works for you. Is that fair characterization?
Yeah, because I think one thing that I think is important to highlight here is that when you do think about augmenting, right? So let's say you hire somebody for 6 months, right? After 6 months you might not need that person, and that person ends up going somewhere else, right? Gets hired by a different company, and then you have the need immediately after, let's say, 1 month,
Hmm.
and then you want the same person because that same person has worked in your environment, they know,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, I think, so there's pros and cons,
Yeah,
right?
so
So
I'll give you a
yeah,
counter example to this, right? So I think you're right with what you're saying, and this is kind of my example, my experience at Razorpay as well, where you rather hire only unless it's a very tactical thing. But I've in my consulting days, I've worked with many very large customers, and when I say very large, I mean like Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 type companies, right? And these are non-engineering led companies. They have a very different approach to this, right? So their point is everybody they hire is a generalist. I mean, they may have like a cybersecurity degree and all that, but they don't do tasks. They manage tasks. Okay, and their point for that is that hey, they have like a muscle, like a build, operate, transfer type muscle. So basically, they're like anything that needs to be built. The same person cannot build five different things. Like today, you may be doing SaaS, tomorrow you may be doing DaaS, tomorrow day after you may be doing something else, and there's no way one person can know all that. So what we do is we hire a really strong person who's kind of seen security happen and who understands the subject matter, but may not have the skill set to do this themselves. So then what they
by
do is
themselves.
that then they go and get consultants to do these things, right? So you hire someone to build your dash program, you hire someone to do the SaaS tooling,
Mm,
or if you're buying a SaaS product from a vendor, then you'll use them to do the professional services to do the integration and all that. But the company has a culture of build, operate, transfer, so they know how to have somebody to kind of come in and integrate the tools in your environment and then take ownership of it, right? So they know how to transfer that knowledge. They have set processes for that, right? And then
very
they
interesting.
also use like very useful contracting. So for instance, they'll say, hey, we paid whatever, like $500,000 to get this static analysis tool rolled out to all 15 business unit, and it's your job to make sure that every pipeline that we have has this integrated. So they do that, and once that's done, they say, okay, that happens in, I don't know, 9 months, and then from the 12th or from the 10th month onwards, you don't have like a 17-member team doing the integration or 7-member team, but you have two people who are on support, right? So then what they do is the two people who are on support, they try to not use them, they try to manage it internally now that the tooling is set up, and only when that fails they go back to them. And then maybe 2 years later, once the entire company knows exactly how to use it and you've built in that energy, that knowledge to manage the tool, they don't need the two people anymore, and you just rely on support channels and stuff like that, right? So I think
Mm,
that there are just many different business models, and it really depends on the size
yeah,
of a company and kind of how you do. I see large enterprises are fantastic at this kind of people risk management, right? Because they're so
got
large,
it.
they can't really rely on one individual to do a lot of work, right? So they kind of
Yeah,
the reliance on process and management is a lot more than reliance on human skill per se.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because my recent experience has been working in uh, companies that are more technology heavy, right? And more engineering heavy. So yeah, the reliance tends to be more on, like security engineers and hiring full time. But yeah, I think that makes sense. Each company operates and has different kinds of risk and whatnot. So
Yeah. No.
totally.
Okay. I mean, I agree with you on that. I know we wanted to talk about kind of things like, um, you know, automation that has like outsized impact in the future, right? Which kind of reduces this back and forth synchronous contact, or communication with teams too much communication with teams, right? So an example of that, I think you wanted to talk about is things like secure defaults, or even having finding ways to eliminate whole classes of vulnerabilities, right? Do you want to talk
Mhm.
a little bit about what's the value of investing in automation and how that helps you kind of like scale in the future?
Yes, absolutely. So I think eliminating vulnerability classes, and I think we've spoken about this before as well, but the idea is that um, if you are aware of a certain vulnerability class, which basically which means there are multiple instances of it throughout different applications, throughout different infrastructure, then you can't really play whack-a-mole with these kind of issues, right? You have to identify the root cause of it, like why is it happening. Is it something to do with the framework, right? Or is it something to do with the programming language which you use? Is there anything that you as a security engineer can do to make this problem completely go away, right? Because you spend hours, and it's not just one person, there's multiple people involved, right? You have to work with the engineering, and for each instance which gets reported either internally, like if it is found by somebody internally or gets reported by somebody externally, it's just too many people resources getting wasted, right? So I think secure by default with libraries or secure frameworks, these days most modern programming languages, they come with like some of these by default, so you don't even have to figure about things like cross-site scripting, right? So I think that becomes really important, and the way we can club this with automation is that you can, once you're aware of a certain vulnerability class, and once you know that, look, there is a secure by default framework that you can just use to make this problem go away, you can automate first finding all such instances everywhere in your organization. That is something that can be easily automated, right? And then once you do that, you can write a SaaS rule to prevent it from happening again. So if somebody tries to use the insecure way, you just make it very difficult, because you have a SaaS rule that alerts when somebody's trying to do that, and they just kind of guide the person in using the correct secure by default library, right? So I think automation there can be really handy, and I think folks should be doing that. So
Yeah.
if I were to like sum it up, using automation to eliminate vulnerability classes is how you can scale um, an AppSec team.
Yeah, I think in this particular case, having a small AppSec team is kind of an advantage. And the reason I say that is because if you have a largest application security team, the quickest way to solve a problem is do like vulnerability by vulnerability stuff, right? And it's possible to do it because you have the people to do it, right? So you'll be
Hmm.
tempted to program manage and get a quick fix. But if you have a really small team, you'll hit that threshold very quickly and you have no option but to do this, right? So you're better off spending time. I mean, you can either do that or do like a really bad job at AppSec, which I don't think you want to do, right? So I think one way it forces you to kind of think about a little more long term, to think about, hey, how can we eliminate vulnerabilities? If you have like architects in the company, this is a good place to sit and brainstorm with them, because depending on your tech stack, there may be things you can do to eliminate whole classes of vulnerabilities, right? They can be things you can do at like the infra layer, which kind of hides a lot
Yeah,
of the vulnerabilities, in an app layer, which may not be. I'm not recommending that you should never fix them, but you can make just certain things irrelevant, right? Like for example, if you have like
yep,
a just things like, if it is a company which has no VPN, and therefore everything needs to be looked at as an external application, so maybe you can find some way of either, I don't know, doing 2FA, or using like OAuth or something, or if you're a little more traditional, maybe using VPN, to kind of make sure that, hey, you just dramatically reduce the risk of something now by doing
yeah,
one thing which made life easier, right? Now this doesn't mean that you should not fix vulnerabilities on internal applications. It just means you can sleep better at night, right? Because Tomcat server is not exposed to the world now, right? So I think that way, I think there's a lot of security you can build in without actually fixing vulnerability by vulnerability. And one way of doing that is secure by default libraries, make sure the whole thing is absolutely secure. Another way of doing it is that managing risk in like ways which is not obvious, which may not be perfect, but it at least reduces the chances of an incident, like the likelihood goes down, and therefore you can focus on other things where there's no way to reduce likelihood. Like you have a real vulnerability on a production site, no option, you got to go fix it, right? Okay, so that kind of makes a lot of sense as well. Anything else you kind of wanted to talk about? Any other tips and tricks you can use to kind of help when you have a really small application security team?
communication
Mm,
becomes important. I feel like we haven't discussed about this at
yeah.
all, but I think effective communication or having good like soft skills. I think I've seen Rob Wood, right, which we who we both know. I think he started a company. I believe it's called Soft Skills of Cyber or something like that. I don't. I haven't looked into it, but I think I've spoken to him before, and he's specified that having good communication skills is so important, and that's one of the reasons why he is where he is right now. So I think again, and security engineers can be nerds, they can be introverts, and this is actually a truth, right? Like, I'm sure you've seen folks as well. um, I think folks who are extrovert and folks who can have conversations, can build relationships, actually have an advantage in this industry as compared to folks who, again, I'm not saying that it is right or wrong. I'm just saying that the majority of the folks who at least I've known and I've seen, they just would rather be left alone, right? And I think if communication was a strong suit, right, like, they would obviously do that, but it's just not, and they're aware of that. But having said that, I think communication becomes huge in the AppSec, in
Yeah.
any AppSec team, just because you're trying to ask somebody to fix it. Like, if you don't ask it in a good way, i- things are not going to get fixed. Curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
No, no, yeah. Before I get to that, so Rob Woods, and I think his, he has a co-conspirator in that project as well. The site is called Soft Side of Cyber. Phenomenal site,
Software.
like really good learning resources. Fantastic kind of post on it as well. So I think definitely you should go check it out. I think it's true, not just of security folks, but in general in engineering. Um, you know, uh, there are people who are introverts, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. You should celebrate them, right? But it does bring this problem of communication. Two things. One is, yeah, it's continual improvement. You have to kind of figure out how you can communicate. You have to figure out what kinds of communications are your strong suite and double down on that. So maybe if you're someone who doesn't enjoy public speaking and talking too much, then maybe you can optimize on Slack a lot more, right? So you can maybe you can write more and then make it easy for people to kind of read your thoughts and stuff like that. So maybe emails, regular emails, crisply well written emails are your thing. Maybe you're someone who really enjoys talking, in which case you can walk into meetings, hold a room together, etc., right? So one thing is just optimize for your style and what works for you, and continuous improvement. The second thing, and I think will sound like a broken record here, but even in communication you can automate. Right? There's a lot of things where regular frequent communication, which happens every Friday at 10 a.m. kind of thing, is actually pretty useful, right? So for instance, if you can automate sending useful weekly reports to your stakeholders, that's something which is pretty useful, right? Again, focus on useful communication, like you don't want to spam the hell out of them, right? But if you can kind of send meaningful information every month, like for example, for every engineering manager, if you can talk about the top 5 vulnerabilities in their span, and this is something which is queryable if you have a system, then you can automate that, right? And that way they kind of get something on their inbox, like especially if like for example, most teams have like a sprint review every 2 weeks, or a weekly review. They have like a retro where they do sprint planning, where they figure out what they do in the next sprint. And if that's Thursday for pod X, then make sure that on Wednesday evening send this email with all the top 5 things. Then you're probably influencing the chances of them picking up fixing this particular bug in the next sprint is probably higher, just because you got the communication out at the right time, right? So that's something you can think
Mhm.
about. So even if you're of course, if you're like introverted and don't like speaking, there are certain things that you cannot do, but I don't think that's a limitation for good communication at all. Especially if you're like a global company. I've seen this happen. I'm from India. I've worked for American companies. I've worked for customers in Southeast Asia and then sometimes in China as well. And yeah, it's not just about whether you're an introvert. It's also whether you can communicate in the language that's comfortable for everyone, right? But you
Yeah.
can write, right? I mean, I mean, obviously, if you're in security, if you're tech, you can write. And now, if you have ChatGPT, so if you can't write, you can fix your grammar using ChatGPT
There
as
you
well.
go.
So
ChatGPT to the rescue.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
So my sense is, I think communication is different from talking. Like, I love talking. That doesn't mean that I'm good at communicating, right? Maybe I talk too fast, maybe I talk too much, etc. So I think thinking about good communication and optimizing for that is important. And don't shy away from using tools. Don't listen to extroverts who say everything has to be like custom handmade. Like, no, you can automate if you can be effective. Like, effectiveness in communication is what's important, not exactly how you do it, right? So if you can optimize on that, I think that'll be great.
Yeah, no, I think you explained it better
Yeah.
than I did. So
No.
there you go.
Yeah.
One other thing that I think I wanted to talk was, when we talk about vulnerability discovery and triage, right? Like, and then you have different sources from where you're receiving all these vulnerabilities, right? How do you funnel everything in one place? I think I would love to know, how you've seen this problem being solved in innovative ways. But I think this is an area that uh, I think remains unknown, just because different companies have different tools and whatnot. So every company tries to solve it in different ways. So have you seen anything innovative?
I mean, I've seen many boring things, but not super innovative things. The way I think about it again is that the first step is prioritization. If you've not already done that, that's great. I think there are tools like Defect Dojo which kind of do a good job. They're enough open source tools.
Right.
We found when I was working at Razorpay that Defect Dojo was great, but it just had too many things going on, right? So we kind of had to like strip it down to the bare minimum and kind of focus on what's important. I highly recommend for people building vulnerability management applications for internal using. Don't try to combine analytics, displaying vulnerabilities, metrics all into one platform. They're all different things, right? And they're all consumed in different ways. So you need to figure out if your vulnerability management platform is a place for you to do triage or for you to communicate, for, let's say, a developer to find out everything about a vulnerability, or is it a place where you want to give high level overview of what's happening? So let me repeat that, right? Triage is you want to know if this vulnerability is real or not. So usually used by security engineers, sometimes by developers and security champions as well. The second thing is details about a vulnerability, where it helps developers actually fix problems. So you have everything you need to understand the problem and fix it. The third thing is metrics, which is more or analytics, sorry, not metrics, where you kind of trying to understand overall what's going on, right? You're a
Mhm.
director and you want to know how many vulnerabilities you have open, right? And how many you're coming up to the end of the SLA or something like that, right? So these three are different, right? For triage, for example, I feel the native tooling does the best job. So if you're using a SaaS tool, their tool usually is the best way to do triage because they offer all the necessary bells and whistles to do it. So if it's a SaaS tool, you want more, you want to know more about source and sync. If it's a pentest results, you want to know more about what the request response was and finding patterns there, which is slightly different. And it's really hard to build a single triage tool where you can import all the details, but you won't get all the bells and whistles easily. So triaging may be
Mhm.
simpler in the native tools. Looking at vulnerability and details may be simpler in Jira because that's where they look at all bugs. And if you just have security bugs, then that will be simpler. And doing analytics may be simpler in where all the analytics are. So if you're using Looker, or if you're using Power BI, or if you're using some other kind of business intelligence tool in your company, then maybe, or Tableau, that's where your security analytics also should live, right? So from that perspective, I think it's important to figure out which of these three layers your vulnerability management tool is managing, right? So at a company we worked with, we realized that the vulnerability management thing is important as a backend solution, but as a front end, I don't think we need a vulnerability management tool because triage happens in the main tool, displaying of
Yeah.
results happen in Jira, and analytics happens in, I don't know, whatever, Tableau, right? So from
Yeah.
that perspective, vulnerability management almost became like a headless thing, right? Where the goal is to scan, look at every different tool, find the results, do like transformation on those results, assign them to right business units, and then push them to Jira for bug tracking and push them to Power BI or whatever for analytics. So that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know if this works for everyone. I know there are companies who do it very differently, and it works for them as well. So those are kind of like my
I
thoughts.
do. Yeah, no, I do have a question on that. So, have you seen or do you know if of any tool, any platform, any company that, regardless of what scanners you use, can help solve this problem where you're doing you have different kinds of scanners, as what have you, you're doing the triage there, and then there's a way where you can just export the results, right? And then you're using this. So, I'm not saying ASPM, because I think ASPM comes to our
Yeah,
mind
yeah,
when
yeah.
we think about this. But what I'm trying to say is uh, like this platform should not be opinionated, right? Like
Yeah,
it should just kind of work, right? Have you seen anything, or
we
have you
built
worked
one
with any
and we open sourced it. So
okay.
at Razorpay we kind of built a tool called Bhadra. It was based off other open source tools. We didn't build it from scratch, but the idea was exactly what you said. It doesn't do anything fancy. It doesn't tell you what is a vulnerability, what is not. None of that. All it does is that it drills down existing vulnerabilities by business unit, by product, by microservice, and then gives you a list of vulnerabilities, and then you can filter using tool name and all that. That's all it does. Very simple, very
Interesting.
quick. And the idea there was, what's interesting is how the data comes into this. So every day at like I think 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, I don't remember. We should run a bunch of headless tools, which basically grabbed the latest information from every vulnerability scanning tool that we had,
Hmm.
and they would push that to
Hmm.
Bhadra, and we would do it only once a day. Right, so it's kind of
Hmm.
like not super up to date. I mean, it was easy to do it, make it super up to date, but we didn't want to kind of deal with all the complexity with it. And I don't think there were too many people who wanted like real time updates anyway, right? But if you want that, you may have to run that like 10 times a day or 20 times a day. But the idea
Yeah.
was that you have a tool, you have a utility which pings every vulnerability management tool you have, gets the latest information, converts that into a format which is relevant for engineering managers and directors and developers, and pushes that to
Sure.
Bhadra, right? Now, once it pushes to Bhadra, it had an interface where you can see it, but also the creation of Jira tickets, the creation of analytics dashboards and everything was from the Bhadra database, right? Because you had information of all vulnerabilities and the associated business
Got
rules
it.
in one place. And we heavily use cartography here as well to kind of make relations between the vulnerability and the owners.
Yeah.
So this worked very well for us. It was opinionated in the sense that we optimized for minimalism and not for and we relied on other systems to kind of provide you the analytics and stuff. So that way it was opinionated, but it was not opinionated in the sense that it would figure out which vulnerability is more important. Like that is not the job of this tool. It's a dumb
Yeah.
tool that way. What's more important is
Got it.
it is determined by the team, the security team.
So, two questions: is this open source?
Yes, we'll add this link in the show notes. It's called
Okay.
Bhadra, BHADRA, from Raspberry.
Okay.
So you can go see that.
Got it. And how is this different from something like Defect Dojo?
I mean, I think it's basically not that different. It just works for a particular kind of a company where you really want like
Okay.
where you're able to kind of like visualize everything in one place with very little information and just relevant information, right? And the part which I don't know if that's open source is just the agents which kind of pull off. Not like AI agents,
Got it.
but regular agents
Got it.
which pull in the information, right? So that is like a concept that I'm happy to talk about. I think we've the Razorpay team has done talks on that as well in the past, but that's something that
Got
as
it.
well. So yeah, but
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to ask. So, if a company is using Defect or Dojo, should they be also looking at Bhadra?
No, I
Do you
think
think?
I don't think the use cases are that comparable. I think Defect Dojo is
Okay.
super feature rich, right? It kind
Yeah.
of tries to work for all kinds of companies, and that's the cool thing about Defect Dojo. But I think Bhadra is just like works for one kind of company, right?
Got it.
Right, like not super large, reasonably small. When I say small, like medium sized, has a manageable list of has a defined list of people who are responsible for vulnerabilities, and you're able to map them easily. So it works for some kinds of companies.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've spoken for almost an hour now, but I have one topic I think which we should talk about briefly and then wrap up, and that is does Gen AI change things? Okay, I am a bit of a broken record on this simply because I'm building like a Gen AI security company, so I kind of think about this all the time. But before I go off on my rant, which I think you won't be able to stop me once I start, is that is what do you think about it? Like, does that make a difference? Is that a tool? Should we just ignore it? What do you think?
Yeah, man. Like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure you've seen, but 2 days ago, Cognition Labs, they came up with their human AI software engineer, right?
Devon?
So,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
DEVIN.
Devon, yeah.
We'll add the link to the show notes, but I mean, that is the biggest proof you need, right? It's an automated software engineer. That's basically
But
so.
is it an automated
No, I mean,
software security engineer? Like that's the question.
yeah, there you go. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, I think that is the answer, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I am curious to know how you feel about
I
it.
mean,
because
look,
I know
I'm not as optimistic as you are about this. I think there are certain.
really.
Well, I think I'm optimistic that there are certain problems you can solve, but using it as a hammer for everything is going to be hard. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think you can replace like a security engineer with. Again, I haven't played around with Devon yet, so I don't know. But in general, let's say just GPT-4 APIs as your benchmark. I don't think you can replace like security engineers. I don't think you can even replace a whole activity with Gen AI, right? As you know, at CISO we're trying to automate design reviews, security design reviews using Gen AI, and even there we're seeing a value of a human in the loop, right? So what we're essentially saying is that you can dramatically reduce the amount of human effort needed. You can make things remarkably more consistent because now everybody's kind of doing the same previously manual thing using a particular framework. So from those perspectives, I think it's very, very helpful. But I don't think our guiding principle should be, hey, how can we replace a security engineer? And I'm not just saying that because I'm a security engineer too, and I want job security if I ever go look for a job. But I think it's because that's not what GPTs are good at. There's a reason why Copilot and Assistant and chatbots were the best use cases of Gen AI the way it is right now. It's because it's good at helping you with your job, but not good at doing your job. right? You still need to validate what it did and make sure it's okay. So that's why a chat gpt is a better tool for people who already know how to do something but do it faster, better, cheaper, than for someone who's starting from scratch, right? I mean, they can still use it as a learning tool, but they find it harder, right? So my sense is that there are definitely some use cases where gen ai can knock things out of the park. I am very bullish on
Yeah.
things like design reviews. There are people who are trying to also do things like fix code using Gen AI. I am not very
Yeah.
bullish about that because I think that just changes too many things from a culture perspective within a company, and kind of you don't want security tools fixing things. I mean, if there's a dev tool which is fixing code, I'm okay with it because the whole tool is owned by a developer. But a tool which is owned, quote unquote, owned by a security engineer, which fixes code, man, I think that's going to set off some cultural issues in a company, right? Nonetheless,
Well,
yeah.
I have to interrupt you and say that this might be a very controversial take, because I mean there are companies that are actually doing that automated
Oh, and
remediation
I hope they succeed.
using Gen AI.
I hope they succeed. I'm
Yeah,
just saying that at this point, I am not convinced. But
yeah.
if you make a list of things that I was not convinced about, but then it succeeded, it's a very long list. So I'll change my mind
Okay.
when I see
I
better.
hope you're wrong here.
I,
Yeah.
I look. I hope I'm wrong too, right? I mean, I'll change my
Okay.
mind with new proof. I have no problem with it, right? But in
Yeah.
general, right? I mean, look, the simplest example I can give you is Dependabot creates PRs when you're using a
Mm-hmm.
insecure version of a library. All it does is it says, hey, it's not v1 from 0.1 version number, it changes it to 1.2 because 1.2 is secure, it's the latest, 0.1 is not. Developers don't will not merge that PR. They will not, because they'll say, hey, what if I can use 1.1? What if 1.2 is not backward compatible? Like there are many legitimate questions they have, and they want to go test it out, and they have a process
Mm-hmm.
in mind for how code needs to be checked in and who needs to review it. And unless you can integrate in that process and have a human in the loop to validate it, it's very hard. So I don't think it's a tech problem, right? I think it's a process and people problem, which means that it'll work in some environments and some it will not. What I'm scared of
Yeah.
doing is committing to saying we'll fix your code.
It'll work for everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, okay, I don't think anyone's claiming it'll work for everybody, but even like that would not be the most exciting use case for me. The most exciting use cases are things which
Yeah.
we've been doing manually forever, which we can
I agree with
finally
that.
automate,
Yeah.
right? And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of one thing where I'm talking about security engineers, not developers, right? So security engineers trying to automate on behalf of developers is crazy. Like, can we start with automating things that we do today manually?
We do. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I spoke
Yeah.
to like a really
Yeah.
large bank. This is a massive multinational bank, and they had a crazy problem statement that I couldn't know existed. Right? So they basically said, "Look, we operate in some, I don't know, dozens of markets, right? Dozens of countries which all have their own compliance requirements. And when a developer has to fix a vulnerability, they'll only fix it if it is a compliance issue as well. So every vulnerability we find, we have to map it to these 20 different compliance standards, not one, not two, but all 20, right? And if we do it right, we increase the chances of that vulnerability being fixed. So now they've automated a lot of the vulnerability defect discovery stuff, but they're having but there's a human mapping every given vulnerability to 20 different compliance standards. And they're like,
Yeah. That's
can
ridiculous.
right? I mean, and they're like, can an LLM do that? And I'm like, what an amazing use case. That makes complete sense to me, right? I don't think I'll build a product
Yeah.
there, but I hope they build an internal tool using LLMs to kind of do that, right? Um,
Yeah.
maybe you
Dude,
can do this deterministically too, but I think Gen AI can do this much faster, easier, etc.
yeah, you just gave me so many ideas. Let's discuss this offline.
And we should do a podcast on this as well, right? I mean, and we should maybe get somebody else as
Yeah.
well who's thought about
Sounds
this.
fun.
Yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
I think in general I'm optimistic about Gen AI solving point problems, and I think there are areas where if you're thinking of building something, it's also who is doing it, right? So if you're a static analysis tools, you can maybe make better your tool better using Gen AI, or you can inject Gen AI to make it slightly better. But if you're building a static analysis tool from scratch, starting with Gen AI at its core may not be the right solution, right? Just because
Yeah.
there's already so many things that the existing tools have already done, and you need to rely on them, right? So if you're building something from scratch like I am, then you may want to pick use cases where it's a bit of a white space where nobody's doing anything about it. But if you're an internal security team, I think you have a lot of options to automate things
Yeah.
internally using Gen AI. Highly recommend doing a Gen AI hackathon with your security engineering team to see what they can come up
Yeah,
with.
man.
It's a great start. Yeah.
Yeah. For
Okay.
sure. There's yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Hey, so that was it for today. I think just to quickly summarize what we spoke about, I think the one word answer to Nipun's excellent question is probably automation. But obviously, there's a lot more to talk about it. We kind of spoke about it from two different perspectives, from defect discovery and fixing, and just communication and the softer side of application security. And in each of them, we spoke about kind of where you can automate, where you probably cannot automate, and how you can kind of help things scale. Right? We spoke about secure defaults. We spoke about managing vulnerabilities in a whole bunch instead of doing it one by one, and you can do that by secure defaults, you can do that by reducing attack surface, you can do that by compensatory controls, and so on and so forth. And that's probably what you should focus on. And finally, we spoke about how we are semi optimistic, both of us, I guess, on how Gen AI can also help you in this journey. So thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Anshuman, and that's it for today.
Thank you, Sandesh. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.